As Algeria and the world become increasingly urbanised, with ever more of us packed together in ever smaller spaces, and some university campuses being like small cities themselves, how do we avoid also building up emissions, pollution, contamination, and all the other environmental impacts that we naturally have as part of modern city life? What are attainable, sustainable targets, whether we're designing new places and spaces or adapting existing ones? And if we're to truly have greener cities and universities, do we need to change how we live, study, work, play, and move around in them? These are some of the aspects of this, but to paraphrase a line from a 1950s American cop show, i.e. long before most of you were born, there are 8,000 stories in the greener city. These are just some of them. Our focus is on solutions and improvements, not cataloguing problems and ascribing blame.
So my perspectives around greening campuses and future cities and transport are based on 15 years of experience of driving sustainability within a university. And so I'm going to focus on the built environment of a university and how we can learn from that. And so we can see universities as mini cities, as Quentin just said, and this means they can be really useful living labs to explore sustainable solutions, sort of real live sort of time and with real live people. But there's lots of ways that we can green our campuses, our cities, but so much of those things are invisible. And that means that staff, students, other people aren't necessarily aware about all of those sustainable solutions. And we're maybe missing an opportunity to help people learn or to help educate people about these solutions. So I think there's some practical actions we can do around trying to think, how do we make the invisible visible? How do we make those invisible aspects of sustainability visible on our campuses so everybody can learn about it? But we can also think about how we can link our curriculum, the taught stuff, with our estate. So, for example, for 10 years, I've run a module called Greening Business, and part of that involves our people who run the estate setting projects that student groups that they work on to provide sort of sustainable solutions. And at a higher level, we have a sustainable consultancy module with students working with external partners in a similar sort of way. So we can link the student activity with driving real change within the campus and our mini city. If as a student you don't have those opportunities, there might be things that you can design yourself with real sort of partners and real people in terms of driving your own project design. At the core of all of this, though, I think is effective partnerships and relationships. And that could be really in any sort of element. But I think if we focus on sort of thinking about cities and transport, there are so many different stakeholders involved who all need to be able to work together effectively. And so we might think about formal structures that can bring students into committees with other stakeholders, but equally students can drive, projects in their own cities, on their own campuses, using their own sort of great ideas, but sometimes might need support to help sort of navigate those structures, again, helping them develop those relationships. So really the end of my few minutes is really to sort of say, there's lots of opportunities for staff, students, estates to get involved in driving sustainable solutions on their own campuses or linked with the cities in which they're located. But at the heart of it are really effective partnerships between all of these different groups and really effective relationships between them. Really that comes down to this idea of using our campuses as living laboratories. And the idea of a laboratory is that we have that opportunity to fail. And the university campus provides us with a slightly different, maybe safer space than a whole sort of city. We might have our own private sort of networks. So, for example, the university I'm at, Keele University, we were the first university in the UK to blend hydrogen into the alive gas grid, and we could do that because we have our own private gas network as a university. But that learning on a university campus, which luckily didn't fail, has allowed us to take that project onto a public site with another real public sort of wider community. You know, this is actually a really exciting time that we're living through for so many reasons, and that's absolutely the case with our energy systems, because we are seeing a real shift in our production of energy. So, you know, particularly in the UK, for example, we've seen real decarbonisation of our electricity, mainly in the UK through offshore wind, but in other countries that will be solar. But it's not just about the generation. We need to, and we are starting to do energy differently. We need to be able to try and match our supply of energy with the demand for energy, and that also that brings in this question of storage. But storage isn't just the answer, because we can also use technology, things like smart energy networks and smart energy grids, to allow us to put certain appliances, for example, running when we know we've got lots of low carbon energy in the grid. But we can also integrate different sources of energy and bring in storage. And for example, hydrogen is a way of storing electricity that's been generated surplus through solar and can be used at another time or even in another season. So I think there's really exciting and interesting things happening in the energy sector, and it is about us doing energy differently. But of course, again, this comes back to the sort of making the invisible visible, because we don't see these changes. And because we don't see these changes, it makes it harder for people to sort of understand what sort of changes are developing. So, you know, within our cities, within our buildings where we have sort of these new smart energy systems or new storage systems, also trying to really help people understand how these new systems and this energy transition works.
Urbanism essentially is about physical infrastructure. It's urban planning, which is about buildings and the space between buildings, the curb heights, trees, the benches, and the stuff, the tangible things. And it's about urban sociology, which is about people. And it's about how people connect with each other and what how they experience the streets and spaces. So urbanism is where the two connect and come together for me. And I think in Sistrans, for a long time we talked about transport, and more we're talking about how transport fits into that wider urbanism work, city and placemaking. I talk about this a lot. I've been so lucky. I've lived in various cities across the world. I grew up in India and Southeast Asia, lived in London and the US, but I made Edinburgh my home in 2004. I came here to do my master's degree and I've stayed. I just love the city. It's magical. Despite the weather, it's magical. So today I'd like to focus in on the work that I'm doing in Scotland and Edinburgh, just very quickly, just to give you an overview of some of what's happening up here and what we can maybe transfer over. So basically, working in Scotland over the past, decade or so, there's a real shift in narrative around transport and city building and placemaking. There's a real acknowledgement of the imbalance and the injustice that is baked into our current transport system. And I think that is a global issue. It's not just one for Scotland or the UK. So, for example, I know, Quentin, you said don't go into the doom and gloom aspect, but there are challenges that I think might be worth highlighting in terms of some of the issues that we are collectively facing. So, there's a real intersection of inequalities. There's a presumption of car ownership. Under 50% of people in most deprived areas of Scotland don't own a car. There's a presumption of A to B journeys that overlook trips that are made from home to school, to work, to the shops, mainly carried out by women, and major roads that cut through inner cities, imposing poor air quality. But the good news is that we have acknowledged these issues. We're starting a conversation in Scotland. It's a very loud conversation right now in the civic, national, local government world around what we do to, as we recover from COVID, how do we tackle these issues, not just for COVID recovery, green recovery, but as we look to the, climate crisis horizon. So in Scotland, there are some amazing policies. You know, the National Transport Strategy, recently refreshed, doesn't just talk about transport. It talks about equality, it talks about the climate crisis, economy, health and well-being. And I think that's quite fantastic because, as Zoe said, it has to be a holistic look at how we approach these issues. In Edinburgh and Glasgow have set ambitious targets to go carbon neutral by 2030. But for too many of us, the local streets don't reflect these amazing policies that we see nationally and locally. Decades of car-centric planning have led to streets where people on foot and bike and public transport have far less priority than private vehicles. But transformation is possible. It's a very loaded word. I talked about that, a lot. You mentioned the City Centre Transformation Project that I led in the City of Edinburgh Council, where we looked exactly at that. How do we reduce vehicular dominance? How do we start to put people at the heart of city building? How do we start to engage people who live in the city, who live and work and play, in actually shaping what they want their city to be? And transport is an enabler of good city building. It's not an end in itself. So the conversations we're having right now is around 20-minute cities, or 20-minute neighborhoods, 20-minute communities. How do you connect them across the city? And for me, that is exciting because change is tough and transformation isn't easy, but to have conversations around how we make change happen. The 20-minute concept seems to be one that really has caught people's imagination, and it does mask the complexity required to deliver it, but it's really an interesting way of framing what we need to do. And it's not about car-free streets and zero emission, net zero, and all of that. I think the narrative around that has to change to be about what happens to our spaces when traffic is taken away, where music and art and theatre and business can thrive, and a different soundtrack to the city than the hum of traffic. So for me, I just want to end on that that isn't possible without collaboration. We, again, picking up on Zoe's point there, we have to have a collective, proactive approach and to reimagining a new way of life, rather than expecting a return to the so-called normal when we come out of COVID. We have to shape our future and avoid embedding the existing inequalities that we see, and help shape cities that are fairer, that are healthier, and truly resilient. It's about living locally. It's about having your amenities within a 20-minute walk of everything you need within a 20-minute walk, whether it's your school or a nursery, your health center, your library, everything that you need for your daily life to lead a good life within 20 minutes. As I said, it's a very, Paris at the moment has rebranded its strategy. The mayor, Anne Hidalgo, talks about the 15-minute city and a collection of neighborhoods, which I think is lovely, 20-minute communities where people can come together, social cohesion. So essentially, it's about transport and planning coming together to make our places better. It's a very simple concept, I think, and as I said, it masks the complexity, what is needed to deliver it. But if we can, it's amazing.
I'm going to do a bit of looking back and looking forward. For me, this is a personal journey because my PhD subject was on transport and environment policy all the way back 30 years ago. And at that time, I was looking a further 30 years back at, simply put, at why it was that we understood that our transport policies in Britain were badly designed, and yet we kept making the same mistakes. The conclusion to my PhD was more or less, why? And now therefore I've got a 60-year record of asking why are we continuing to make the same mistakes? So every time we have an opportunity to think differently, I'm just going to sketch out some observations about what the core of those answers might be. One of the first things I guess I'd want to observe is that cities don't happen by accident. Now, we can leave them to happen by accident, but with the right ambition and imagination and determination, we can create the cities we want, rather than be delivered the cities that other forces shape. But futurologists haven't always done a great job of anticipating that combination can really make a change: imagination, ambition, determination. So in the 1880s and 1890s in London, there was great concern that if horse traffic increased at the level that it appeared to be, that London would be smothered in horse dung. And the pollution crisis of the day was organic horse manure. Now, actually, within only a couple of decades, there was a very different set of concerns, which was the private motor car, which was deemed to be a hazard apt to become a nuisance, in the words of a 1910 House of Commons report. The same report suggested that the taxation of the private motor car really shouldn't be a problem. And if you were going to categorize it, it should be, because it was a luxury apt to become a nuisance, it should be categorized alongside boa feathers, the wonderful long adornments that the ladies wore, or billiard balls for the snooker, the games that were played by the wealthy gents. Actually, that idea that private road traffic should be taxed as a luxury apt to become a nuisance is an important reference point as we work out how we might make our cities differently today. And in winning that objective of taxing things properly and investing in the green modes that Daisy and Zoe have pointed to, green modes of walking and cycling, so making them the core of our priorities, then supporting public transport options, then allowing for private mobility, because it's fantastic. We've got this ambition, many of us, for 2 cars outside our house, because they're fantastic. It's the wrong answer to the question, but we've got to respect why people have sought that. So what we know about green modes of walking, cycling and public transit, and we can consider taxis and other similar forms as part of a public transport solution properly. Those we know can give us a much better quality of life, much better health outcomes for all people. They are much better for the poorest members of society, as Daisy has pointed out. And that's important if you want to consider the social sustainability of our cities in the long term. I think if you were trying to do a deal, however, with my colleagues along the street who do enjoy 1 or 2 cars, is to remind them that, I think it was Le Corbusier, the French architect, who worked, of course, a lot in North Africa, who observed that every time we sit behind a car wheel, we are engaging in unpaid labour on our way to work. So actually, in Britain, typically, people are putting in an hour and a half a day when under normal circumstances in their car commute. This is unpaid labour that we should give back to them through a new approach. So I guess my last thought is that I live in the city of Cambridge, and I live there really because it is a 20-minute city. From the age of 10 onwards, my children were able to walk and cycle to everything that they did, which gave me back more time. So I just observe these many benefits of making best use of the automobile and releasing ourselves from some of the tyrannies that allowing it to accidentally take hold of our decisions can deliver. I don't think humanity is about to wake up in the morning and stop being competitive and showy. We enjoy displaying our achievements. We like to show off new stuff. What I think we do have the opportunity to, if we put the correct price on goods and tax them correctly, is to redefine quality. And redefining quality can and should include a rather showy display of how wonderful your quality of life is. My commute is more beautiful than yours because I take it on this rather wonderful bicycle through this or I walk through this delightful park that we helped to design in the last 5 years, or whatever it may be. So redefining quality is, I think, an essential part of achieving sustainable cities. I don't think we should expect that we can dictate whether people are in cities, in suburbs, or distributed between urban and rural. All three of these things are going to happen. And if we know one thing about planning, and we've also got an architect present, it's that we've always been overconfident about our capacity to tell everyone how to live. But what we do know is that we do have positive examples of each of those ways of organising ourselves. And indeed, COVID has brought us many difficult things. It's made many things difficult in households, in communities, in businesses. But it's also taught us a whole lot of things that we can do without the need for travel. In my own institution, there was a sense that it would be difficult for us to organise to do meetings at a distance and to project our lectures over the internet. I was told it would take me a couple of years to fulfil my ambitions. Well, it turned out to take a couple of days. And I would like to see us ask ourselves the same provocative questions about how dense cities, suburban layouts, and more distributed rural settings could all see the carbon in their mobility choices and in their mobility planning. One little thing that would help is to stop having ministries of transport and departments of transport and start having ministries and departments and committees for access. Ask ourselves a different question. How do we deliver access to the things we want in the lowest carbon way? I think that would really help us, because we've just proved across the last year in many parts of the world, in many circumstances, that we can find other ways of doing things.
My current work is around research around transport and society. But going back a few years, I was traveling across Algeria, found myself in the middle of the Sahara, 100 kilometers north of Tamanrasset. And there I lost my faith in the internal combustion engine because my truck I was on broke down. And I ended up spending 20 days stuck in the middle of Algeria. So faith lost in that form of transport, or that way of getting around. But I don't think that the internal combustion engine has come to an end. Its usefulness, even in privately owned vehicles, still has a place in society, as has already been mentioned by Joe and others. But I do question its place and its primacy in cities. I was recently doing a literature review around speed, comparing the average speeds of different transport modes in cities. And it's interesting that the modes that use the internal combustion engine, cars, trucks, buses, vans, are getting slower on average in many of our cities. For example, in London, the city I was born in inner London now, the average speed of cars is slower than it was back in 1949. And you can see the inefficiency of those modes in cities when they're travelling far below their design speeds. People get frustrated whether they're sitting in those cars or whether they're being obstructed by those cars because of congestion. In some cities, are actually quicker to run at peak times than it is to drive or to catch a bus. It's usually twice as fast to cycle or use an e-bike or an e-scooter, which are increasingly becoming popular and useful modes across cities. And of course, walking, which has been mentioned by some of our speakers already, is an efficient mode and has been for centuries and centuries for short local journeys. And thinking about history, if I look at UK cities, I can see that walking and cycling was the dominant mode from about the 1890s right through to the First World War. Then there was a sort of period of transition to public transport, which dominated in UK cities through to the 1960s. And since then, we've transitioned, as Joe and others have already mentioned, to a dominance and reliance on the private motor vehicles. And there is some parallel if we look at Algeria, we can still see in the cities cities designed around walking, in places like the Souk in Constantine or the walled city of Gardaya down in the desert. And many Algerian cities today have modern tram systems, but if you look at Oran and some of the coastal cities, they already had electric trams back in the 19th century. And of course, today, cities like Algiers and some of the coastal cities have their urban motorways and highways, typical of cities around the world, dominated by the car. But there's some signs that since the turn of the millennium, since 2000, some cities are beginning to change. Just going back to my natal city of London, public transport since 2000 is once again the dominant mode in London. And since 2009 in inner city London, walking and cycling rates are actually higher than the average, than the use of the private vehicles. So just going back to my current research, I'm looking to understand how street use behaviour, design and regulation contribute to a street environment and culture that's conducive to movement on foot and cycle. And when I'm talking about a street environment and culture that is conducive, I'm thinking of one that's safe, one that's comfortable, one that's direct, one that's attractive, one that's coherent, one that's legible, one that's connected and inclusive to movement on foot and cycle. So finally, turning our attention to university campuses, if you like, they could be seen as mini cities, or in some cases quite big cities with tens of thousands of staff and students. And perhaps using Daisy's image, perhaps a perfect 20-minute city could be a university campus. So like cities, if we want people to walk and cycle, then those modes need to be an easy, safe and obvious choice on our university campuses for people to make. My own university campus is the University of the West of England in Bristol, and over recent years we've made great efforts to make this a place where people would want to walk and cycle. So the student accommodation in that sort of 20-minute city kind of mould is close to where people study, but it also has everything available within walking and cycling distance. For those that need to go further afield in the city, the campus is not only is the campus designed for walking and cycling with no internal roads, but there are safe, separated walking and cycling routes between the campus and the city. In terms of public transport, there's cheap, fast, 24-hour frequent bus services between the campus and city centre for those that need to go out in the evening and at weekends. And also it's been necessary to make driving inconvenient and expensive. So people turn away from that mode. So by reducing year on year the number of parking spaces available, and those that are left, increasingly making them expensive for people to use. And additionally, in terms of public transport, we've now got a direct long distance coach services direct from the campus to the places where the students live around the country when they need to visit their family and friends. And finally, I think the point I would end on is saying that the university leadership and staff must also support the promotion of low carbon and active travel. It's only if student and staff are working together will these things be achieved. I would say that a good place to start is the university campuses, and if we're talking about being beacons, couldn't some of the university campuses across Algeria be those beacons, both for the cities they're in and for the country as a whole? We've described them as mini cities. They are places where the thousands of students and staff could potentially be role models in terms of walking and cycling and using public transport, being that hotbed of ideas, both practical ones like Zoe's been describing has been put into practice, a keel that you could put into practice in your own university campus. And to work and partner with the local authorities in the city and city authorities in the wider city, so that the university campus can be that example of my emphasis is on the transport things, the walking and cycling, but it could be other things like energy as well. But putting them into practice on the campus and then partnering with the city authorities to see how that could be extended to the wider city.
I just wanted to show off my fancy gilet orange, which I wear as I cycle around the streets of Algeria, and my flashy helmet, which people seem to enjoy. Safety and visibility, killing two birds with one stone. Have a good weekend, everybody.